Hey, PoliSci Files fans, welcome to the deep dive. I'm so excited for this crossover episode.
Yeah, this is going to be fun. A deep dive into the Afghanistan Papers should get everyone thinking.
For sure. So, the Afghanistan Papers, this is a collection of interviews and government documents, right?
Exactly. And what makes them so fascinating is that they weren't meant for public release.
So like a behind-the-scenes look at the war.
Precisely. Journalist Craig Whitlock spent years fighting to get these documents through FOIA requests and lawsuits.
Wow, so we're talking about raw, unfiltered accounts from people who are actually there.
Yes. Interviews with military leaders, diplomats, aid workers, all sorts of folks who had firsthand experience.
Okay, so this is a huge trove of information, and the war in Afghanistan spanned 2 decades.
Right. So much to unpack. Where do we even begin?
Oh, I guess the logical place to start is at the beginning, right? Late 2001 after 9/11.
Good place to start. The U.S. invades Afghanistan with overwhelming public support.
Everyone was united, right? The sense of we have to do something.
Exactly. There was this clear objective to dismantle al-Qaeda and bring those responsible for 9/11 to justice.
Seemed pretty straightforward at the time.
Yeah, but even in those early days, the mission's clarity starts to get a little blurry.
What do you mean?
Well, was it solely about al-Qaeda? Or is there a bigger goal in mind, this idea of transforming Afghanistan into a democratic nation?
So nation building.
Exactly. And these early decisions made in the midst of all the chaos and uncertainty are really crucial to understanding how things unfolded.
And the Afghanistan Papers really highlight this ambiguity, don't they?
They do. There's this memo from Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense, to President Bush.
Oh, yeah, the one where he says, our job is about killing bad guys, so we will have killed the bad guys. Who cares what happens next?
That's the one. And it reveals this kind of dangerous short-sightedness, right? This laser focus on eliminating the bad guys without a clear vision for the future of Afghanistan.
So almost like they were so focused on the immediate threat that they didn't think about the long game.
Exactly. And that lack of long-term vision led to a series of early missteps that had huge implications down the road.
Okay, like what kind of missteps?
Well, one of the most critical was the decision to exclude the Taliban from the Bonn Conference in December 2001.
The Bonn Conference, remind me, what was that again?
It was this gathering of Afghan leaders and international representatives meant to establish a new Afghan government.
Okay, right, so a fresh start for the nation.
Exactly. But the U.S. insisted on excluding the Taliban from this process.
And that was a mistake.
A big one. Lakhdar Brahimi, the UN representative at the time, called it the original sin.
The original sin? Wow, that's a strong statement.
It was a huge miscalculation by shutting out the Taliban. They basically
Right.
pushed them further into the shadows.
And created more resentment and instability.
Exactly. It made reconciliation much harder to achieve down the road.
Like trying to rebuild a house without consulting the people who used to live there?
Right. You're missing a crucial piece of the puzzle, and that's exactly what happened in Afghanistan.
But it wasn't just the political missteps, right? There were also logistical challenges.
Absolutely. In the early years of the war, the U.S. had surprisingly few troops on the ground in Afghanistan.
Really?
Yeah, to put it in perspective, there were actually more U.S. military personnel guarding the 2002 Winter Olympics in Salt Lake City than fighting in Afghanistan.
More troops at the Olympics than fighting a war. That's wild.
It is. And the conditions for the troops who were in Afghanistan were often incredibly primitive.
Like what kind of conditions are we talking about?
Well, one Major David King described his time at Kandahar Airfield saying, there was one shower point in the whole place you have to go in, planning on using a piss tube, and you're going to be crapping in a barrel and burning it with diesel fuel.
Oh, wow. So basic sanitation was a problem.
It was a huge problem, and it speaks volumes about the lack of preparedness and resources dedicated to the war effort in those early years.
So maybe part of the reason for this lack of attention was the growing focus on Iraq, right?
Yeah, the shift in focus to Iraq in 2003 definitely played a role. The U.S. declared major combat operations over in Afghanistan.
But it was obvious that things were far from resolved.
Exactly. Even Afghan President Karzai, during a press conference with Rumsfeld, joked, I thought you had all gone to Iraq.
Even Karzai could sense the shift in attention, the dwindling commitment.
It was a telling moment. Diverting resources and attention to Iraq while downplaying the complexities of Afghanistan set a dangerous precedent that would have long-lasting consequences.
So this disconnect between the rhetoric coming out of Washington and the reality on the ground, That was a theme from the very beginning.
It was, and as we'll see, this disconnect would only grow wider as the war dragged on.
So we're seeing these cracks emerge, right?
Yeah.
This disconnect between what the U.S. government was saying and what was actually happening in Afghanistan.
Yeah, and that disconnect that really becomes a chasm as we move into the mid-2000s.
So the gap widens even further.
It does big time, and
Yeah.
the Afghanistan Papers, they really expose this growing dissonance, you know?
Between the rhetoric and the reality.
Exactly. They give us this glimpse into the private doubts and frustrations of the people who were actually running the war.
So, like, what were people saying behind closed doors? Were they starting to realize that things weren't going as planned?
Oh, yeah, big time. One of the key strategies at the time was building up the Afghan security forces.
The idea being to train them to eventually take over responsibility for their own country.
Yeah. Make Afghanistan self-sufficient in terms of security sounds good in theory.
It does. A self-reliant Afghanistan standing on its own 2 feet, that was the goal.
Yeah, but the interviews in the Afghanistan Papers, they reveal a deep skepticism about this strategy right from the get-go.
Really? So people had doubts from the beginning.
They did, and for good reason. There were so many obstacles, so many challenges that made this goal seem almost impossible.
Like what kind of obstacles?
Well, first off, there was a lack of a clear strategy.
Yeah.
You know, what exactly were these Afghan forces being trained for?
Right. What was their role supposed to be?
Yeah, and Afghanistan is a complex place, right? Long history of tribalism, limited infrastructure, widespread illiteracy.
So trying to create a modern army in that context must have been incredibly difficult.
It was, and there were these huge cultural misunderstandings too, you know?
So like a clash of worldviews.
Yeah, many recruits had no prior experience with modern military concepts. We're talking about a completely different way of life.
The papers must have some funny stories about this, right?
Oh, they do. One trainer described the Afghan soldiers' driving skills, saying, "These guys were a menace to society. They'd let go of the steering wheel, grab the gear shift with both hands, and look at the gear shift, not the road."
I can just imagine that.
Yeah, another trainer mentioned how they had to write names on weapons to teach soldiers about personal responsibility for their gear.
So basic stuff that you wouldn't even think about having to teach.
Exactly. They were starting from scratch in so many ways.
It sounds like an impossible task, trying to build a modern army in a country with so many challenges.
It was, and then on top of all that, you had rampant corruption within the Afghan security forces.
Ah, so you train these guys, invest all this time and resources, and then they just disappear.
That's right. Desertion was a huge problem, especially in the
Right.
police force. They'd take their weapons and turn to crime.
It's like 1 step forward, 2 steps back.
Exactly. A demoralizing blow to the entire effort.
But it wasn't just the internal challenges in Afghanistan, right? There was also the whole issue of Pakistan.
Oh, yeah. Pakistan, a key ally in the war on terror, but also a safe haven for the Taliban and al-Qaeda.
So a tricky relationship to navigate.
Very tricky. The Afghanistan Papers, they detail this frustrating cat-and-mouse game playing out along the Afghan-Pakistan border.
So the U.S. knew that insurgents were using Pakistan as a sanctuary.
They did, but they were limited in what they could do because Pakistan was a crucial ally.
It's like you're fighting an enemy, but your ally is also helping that enemy.
Yeah, a real catch-22 situation.
Yeah.
And there's this sense of disillusionment, you know, even anger in the interviews.
Like they felt betrayed.
Yeah, this feeling that the U.S. was fighting with one hand tied behind its back. There's one quote from a soldier that really captures this frustration. He says, "Guys don't just do that. They're funded in some way. They get equipment. Somehow they have to eat. In other words, it's a system. How are we going to attack that system?" I don't think we ever got answers to those questions.
So they knew something was wrong, but they didn't know how to fix it.
That's right. And then you add another layer of complexity, the narcotics trade.
Right. Afghanistan's a major producer of opium. How did that factor into the war effort?
It was a huge factor. The opium trade was booming, and the Afghan government, they were reluctant to crack down on the drug lords.
Because of corruption.
Partly, yeah, but also fear of backlash. These drug lords, they were powerful.
So you have this massive illegal industry funding the insurgency, destabilizing the government.
Exactly. And the U.S. is stuck in the middle trying to fight a war while grappling with the consequences of this illicit trade.
It's a mess.
It was a total mess. And by the time Obama takes office in 2009, there's this pervasive sense of pessimism among U.S. officials.
So despite all the talk of progress, they knew the war was far from won.
That's right. They knew it was a long shot.
So then Obama comes in and he decides to surge troops into Afghanistan.
Yeah, he's trying to turn the tide, but at the same time, he announces a withdrawal timeline.
So a surge and a timeline trying to balance military pressure with a clear exit strategy.
Exactly, a delicate balancing act. But here's the thing. The Afghanistan Papers reveal that there was also this deliberate effort to manipulate data during this period.
What do you mean manipulate data?
Well, they were trying to present a more positive picture of the war's progress than was actually the case.
So it wasn't just the challenges on the ground, but also this manipulation of information back home.
Precisely, it was happening at multiple levels, from field reports to presentations at the Pentagon. Statistics were massaged, surveys were unreliable, and there was this constant pressure to highlight positive developments while downplaying setbacks.
So basically they were cooking the books.
Yeah. One official, Bob Crowley, described it as, every data point was altered to present the best picture possible. Surveys, for instance, were totally unreliable, but reinforced that everything we were doing was right, and we became a self-licking ice cream cone.
That's scary. If the information being used to make decisions is distorted, it undermines the entire effort.
Yeah, it creates this situation where honest assessments are discouraged and policymakers may be operating under false assumptions.
And it erodes public trust as well.
Absolutely makes it harder to have an open and honest conversation about the war's true cost.
So the U.S. was trapped in this cycle of self-deception, clinging to this narrative of progress, even as the situation on the ground continued to deteriorate.
That's right, a classic case of denial.
And all of this was happening while the U.S. was pouring billions of dollars into reconstruction projects in Afghanistan.
Yeah, billions and billions. But the Afghanistan Papers show this recurring pattern of waste mismanagement and a real disconnect from the actual needs of the Afghan people.
Like they were building stuff that the Afghans didn't even need or want.
That's right. There's this one anecdote that really illustrates this disconnect. It involves a brand new police headquarters built by the U.S. with all the bells and whistles.
Sounds impressive.
It was. But the problem was the police chief couldn't even open the door to his own headquarters.
He couldn't open the door?
Nope. He had never seen a doorknob before.
You can't make this stuff up.
It's almost comical, but it also highlights this deeper issue, right?
Of trying to impose our own ideas and systems on a culture that may not be ready for them.
Exactly. Good intentions, but often misguided.
And then you had the insider attacks this terrifying phenomenon of Afghan soldiers and police turning their weapons on their American and NATO allies.
Yeah, a real surge in these attacks during Obama's surge.
What do you think caused that?
Well, the Afghanistan Papers suggest that it was a sign of growing resentment, a breakdown in trust, you know?
Like they were turning on the very people who were supposed to be helping them.
Yeah, and imagine the psychological toll on U.S. and NATO soldiers constantly looking over their shoulder, wondering if the guy they're training might turn on them.
Must have been terrifying.
It was a constant fear, and so by the end of Obama's presidency, despite the surge, despite the billions spent, Afghanistan was still mired in conflict.
No closer to peace.
Not really.
Yeah.
The U.S. was stuck in a stalemate, unable to achieve a decisive victory, but also reluctant to withdraw completely.
So what did Obama do?
He chose to maintain a residual force in Afghanistan, basically acknowledging that a full withdrawal could lead to the collapse of the Afghan government.
So the U.S. presence became a kind of crutch.
That's right, preventing the Afghan government from truly standing on its own 2 feet. And this is the situation that Trump inherits when he takes office.
So Trump comes in and he's got this America First agenda, and he's talking about ending forever wars. You'd think Afghanistan would be at the top of his list to wrap up.
Yeah, you'd think so, but it didn't quite play out that way.
Really, why not?
Well, Trump was definitely skeptical of the war, but he also didn't want to be seen as weak on terrorism, you know?
Right, that whole image thing.
Exactly. So he was torn between his own rhetoric and the advice of his military advisors, this tug of war between wanting to withdraw and not wanting to look bad.
So what did he end up doing?
Well, initially, he actually deployed more troops to Afghanistan.
More troops? I thought he was all about ending the war.
He was, but it was more complicated than that. He seemed to be searching for this middle ground, you know?
Trying to have it both ways.
Exactly. And another key aspect of Trump's approach was a much greater emphasis on secrecy.
Secrecy in what way?
Well, he basically said, we're not going to talk about troop numbers or military plans anymore.
Less transparency.
Exactly, much less. And his administration really clamped down on information, made it much harder to get a clear picture of what was actually happening in Afghanistan.
So did this shift towards secrecy affect the conduct of the war?
It definitely made it harder to assess the war's progress and hold those in power accountable for their actions.
And wasn't there also a big increase in airstrikes under Trump?
Yeah, a huge increase. And the Trump administration, they also loosened the restrictions on airstrikes, which led to a lot more civilian casualties.
That's awful.
Is a really controversial aspect of his approach, raised some serious ethical questions about the cost of this secret war.
A secret war with a hidden human cost?
Exactly. And then, of course, you have negotiations with the Taliban.
Right. Trump was the first president to really sit down with the Taliban, wasn't he?
He was, and these talks eventually led to the Doha Agreement in 2020, which was supposed to pave the way for a full U.S. withdrawal.
The deal was done.
On paper, yes, but many people saw this agreement as flawed and rushed, like Trump was just trying to get out no matter what.
To fulfill a campaign promise.
Right, and so this is the mess that Biden inherits when he takes office.
A ticking time bomb.
Pretty much, he's facing this looming withdrawal deadline, and the Taliban is gaining strength by the day.
So what does Biden do?
Well, he was in a tough spot. He didn't negotiate this deal, but he also didn't want to just tear it up and start over.
So he felt bound by it?
In a way, yes. And he also argued that the U.S. had already achieved its initial objective, which was to dismantle al-Qaeda.
The mission had changed.
Exactly. And Biden felt that staying longer wouldn't fundamentally change the situation.
So he decides to stick with the withdrawal timeline.
He does. And we all know what happened next. The chaotic scenes of the U.S. withdrawal, the collapse of the Afghan government, the Taliban takeover.
It was heartbreaking to watch.
It was a tragic end to America's longest war.
And the Afghanistan Papers, they really provide this sobering look at how we got to that point, don't they?
They show us the missteps, the miscalculations, the outright lies that led us down this path.
So what are the key takeaways? What lessons can we learn from all of this?
Well, for me, one of the biggest lessons is the importance of honesty and transparency in wartime.
Right, because when information is manipulated, when the true costs of war are hidden, it becomes impossible to have a real debate about what we should be doing.
Exactly. We end up sleepwalking into disaster. And another crucial lesson is the importance of clearly defined objectives.
Yeah.
You know?
Like, what are we actually trying to achieve with military intervention?
Right. And how will we measure success if we don't know what we're trying to accomplish? We're just setting ourselves up for failure.
So Afghanistan, it's a cautionary tale, a reminder that even with the best of intentions, things can go horribly wrong.
Yeah. And that we need to be really clear-eyed about the costs and consequences of military action.
Well, PoliSci fans, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the Afghanistan Papers. It's been a heavy topic, but an important one.
Definitely. And for our regular deep dive listeners, we'll be back next week with a new topic, something a little lighter, I promise.
Until then, keep asking those tough questions, keep learning, and keep diving deep.